I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Economists say Canada's rapid population growth is challenging their understanding of the economy. This comes as they monitor how businesses and consumers are responding to high interest rates. The Canadian economy is outperforming expectations this year and avoiding the slowdown that many forecasters were anticipating in response to the Bank of Canada's aggressive rate hikes. A closer look at the numbers shows high population growth is partly responsible for the strong economic results. BMO chief economist Douglas Porter says the Canadian economy is adding around 25,000 jobs per month. This is compared to the typical 10,000 to 15,000 jobs. And it makes Mr. Porter reconsider what a normal monthly jobs report should look like. Well, joining us now to talk more on population growth and its economic impact on Canada is Dr. Moshe Lander, an economist and professor at Concordia University. Dr. Lander, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hello.
Always great having you, sir. Now, in what ways does population growth impact the economy as a whole?
Well, it affects it in lots of ways, right? If you have people moving to Canada, that means that they're brand new consumers that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And they're also producers too, right? They're going to take jobs, they're going to build businesses. They bring diversity with them. If they're coming from outside of Canada, that means they're bringing parts of their culture, which means some of their tastes and preferences are going to be different than, say, incumbent Canadians. And that brings diversity then to the economy as well. It brings a variety of different viewpoints and opinions. So generally, it's a very positive thing to have people moving to Canada.
And why are current numbers pertaining to population growth challenging the research of economists?
So part of it is that in the past, the number of people moving to Canada was rather predictable. It was controlled by the government and limitations on how many people could move. There's still limitations, but even where they're coming from is different. Primarily, a lot of the immigrants that were coming were, say, Western European, and then it slowly started to shift to Central and Eastern European, now Middle East, Africa. And so as you start to bring in different people from different backgrounds, the standard sort of behavior that we would know when they come, this is how they're going to behave when they get here, is starting to change too.
All right, Dr. Lander. Now, I guess the bigger question here would be, is this population growth and the impact that it has? If we're looking at the impact here, we're seeing more jobs, up to 10,000 more jobs per month, consumer spending, as you highlighted, on the rise as well, all adding to the greater economic pie, if you will. So is this a good thing, or are there some cons to consider here?
On the whole, it's a good thing. Most people that are moving to Canada are net contributors. There's a stereotype out there that they are here to leech off of the system and take advantage of our public welfare. That's not true. They contribute more than they use. So that's a positive for taxpayers then who are not experiencing higher taxes than necessary. The con side of it is that I think a lot of municipalities are not prepared for this higher level of immigration that's coming. And so things like the housing market, the healthcare system, the school system is not equipped for the number of people that are coming. And that requires a lot of planning in advance to anticipate what's coming. And so if those numbers have jumped, it doesn't seem that municipal services or provincial services have managed to make that jump with them.
All right, Dr. Lander, I want to touch on that. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the impact to the housing market. Now, some people are saying that this population rise is boosting the housing market during a time when interest rates are supposed to suppress demand. Can you tell us a little bit more about this trend here?
Sure. So the standard way is when you increase interest rates, it takes all kinds of demand out of the economy, especially things that are interest rate sensitive. And so housing would logically be one of them. But if you have a whole bunch of people that are moving to Canada more than what is the norm, they need a place to live. And so even if they're not coming to buy a home, they need to be able to rent from somebody, which means that that person has to buy a home. So it's driving then the demand side of the market. And so to some extent, it is counterweighing against the higher interest rates. But again, is it a net pro? I would say yes, as opposed to maybe some people who are taking the position that this is now a negative on the economy.
All right, Dr. Lander. And on that note, how do you see this population growth and its broader impact affecting moves by the Bank of Canada, especially in terms of interest rate hikes?
So the issue I would say is that I don't think we're ever going to see the Bank of Canada say, we needed to increase interest rates because of higher immigration, right? They're not a political organization. They don't want to get political, and they certainly don't want to turn immigration into something political. But the reality is that if all of this immigration that's coming into the country is creating a net boost to consumer spending, Yeah, they might have to increase interest rates more than necessary. I would point out, though, that the immigrants that are coming to this country are also producers. And so we should be seeing an increase on the supply side as well. So it's really an issue of not just are they creating only demand without supply, but how is that supply changing relative to demand? If supply is increasing in pace with demand, we shouldn't be seeing any inflationary pressure. Bank of Canada shouldn't have to do anything more than what they would normally do.
All right, Dr. Lander, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
An air deployment exercise billed as the biggest in NATO's history and hosted by Germany has begun. The Air Defender 2023 exercise is set to run from June 12th through 23rd. It includes 10,000 participants and 250 aircraft from 25 countries. The exercise was long planned, but also serves to showcase the alliance's capabilities amid high tensions with Russia. It also comes amid reports of the start of Ukraine's long-expected counteroffensive. Well, joining us now to discuss this is Richard Shamuka, a defense expert and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Mr. Shamuka, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me, Nemo.
So, as we mentioned, this is NATO's largest ever Air Force drill. So, what do we know so far about these exercises and what they would look like?
It's going to run through the entire gamut of sort of operations that are critical to ensure that NATO can defend its some of the border countries that are opposite to Russia. You're going to see operations that include counter-air operations, so defending against potential Russian aircraft incursions, suppression of air defense systems, because Russia is very, very effective air defense systems that NATO is very concerned about. You see logistics, just supporting such a massive enterprise using transport aircraft and sort of on-the-ground logistics. The whole range of what NATO requires to in order to sort of undertake such an operation. They're going to basically do exercises, see how it works, see what they can improve on, and go forward from there.
Sounds like quite the expansive exercise here. So, what is the deeper meaning behind this drill and the message that it sends to Russia?
Well, exercises are a pretty critical part of Western military's sort of day-to-day operations. You'll see major ones. The United States Air Force, for example, runs this very large one called Red Flag, which is similar in sort of its sort of intent and scope is to make sure that pilots and everybody understands what's required. But as you say, there's a big political aspect to it, and it's a signaling mechanism. It shows to potential adversaries like Russia that the NATO alliance can work together and is very concerned about it, that they can work together as an effective force, as however many nations come together to operate as one. But as well, just understanding that we have a credible response to any sort of aggression, that this is that we are concerned about what you're doing, and that our aircraft and we're ready to sort of counter if there is any sort of potential threat.
And although there is not a potential threat right now to NATO, these exercises are also set to prepare air forces in a crisis situation. So, what could a realistic crisis situation for NATO members look like right now?
Well, I think you kind of see. I would say that there has been sort of low-level threats. That Russia has made sort of threatening statements towards NATO about its support for countries. Excuse me, towards their support for Ukraine in their ongoing invasion. So I think that there is some sort of view that we need to be prepared for it. Certainly, defending some of the Baltic states, which are extremely vulnerable to sort of Russian attack, as well as Poland. These are sort of scenarios that can be sort of envisaged, and therefore having a credible response, understanding where are the weak points is pretty critical for NATO itself to prepare or to signal that its preparedness for such a threat.
All right, Mr. Shimuka, a little over a minute left here, but let's talk a little bit about air defense as you highlighted earlier in this interview. Now, we know the U.S. approved the transfer of these highly sought after American-made F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. But where does NATO stand on providing Ukraine with these F-16 fighter jets? We know the Ukrainian military is preparing to be trained to use these F-16s this summer.
This is going to take months, more likely years. Critical sort of the sort of narrow points where there is a lack of capabilities and maintenance. That takes years to get people ready to sort of understand how to sort of maintain this fighter to operate it. Pilots a little quicker. So and also getting the fighters, identifying which ones are going to be provided. This is more of a long-term sort of signal for Ukraine that we're going to support you. Perhaps after this initial invasion's over, that when there's a longer political sort of settlement, that NATO is going to have their back. So I don't see this exactly going to help any sort of existing operation or anything in the medium term at the very, very earliest. But it is an important signal that NATO is going to support Ukraine going forward.
All right, Mr. Shimuka, a quick 30 seconds left here, but anything that you're going to be keeping your eyes on as this counteroffensive by Ukraine continues?
Certainly, it's been interesting to watch how the Ukrainians have been pushing forward. They've been very good at sort of hiding or sort of not showing their hand too much of what they're trying to do. Russia's invested heavily in the defense of the southern provinces, and you're starting to see movement. That there's some successes and some losses, but it's going to be a while yet before we actually see how successful they're being, and whether this will make appreciable gains in the political sort of arena for the war and its termination.
Lots to keep our eyes out for, Mr. Shimuka. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
After over 15 months of Russia's invasion, Ukrainian forces are stepping up long-awaited counteroffensive operations with the help of Western weapons. Ukrainian officials are hailing the recapture of multiple small villages, including 4 frontline villages in the eastern Donetsk region. These are among the first small successes in this counteroffensive. Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar wrote on Monday in the Telegram that the Ukraine flag was again flying over the village of Storozhov. A day earlier, Ukrainian officials said 3 other small villages clustered together in the eastern Donetsk region had been liberated. Well, joining us now to give us the latest on-the-ground updates from Ukraine is Mr. Marian Zablotsky, a member of parliament in Ukraine. He joins us from Kyiv. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So where are we right now when it comes to the early stages of this counteroffensive? What are some of the latest updates you can give us from the front line?
Well, our troops were relatively successful in their initial stages. Unfortunately, Russia has conducted a terrorist act by blowing up the dam near Kherson, which has flooded the areas and has stopped at least part of the counteroffensive. Our troops are very courageous, they are very brave, they managed to liberate some limited territory, but quite honestly, they are fighting with one arm behind their back. So they do not have the air superiority, and unfortunately, their supply of armored vehicles is still relatively low.
So what does the recapture of these smaller villages mean not only for Ukrainian forces, but for the people in Ukraine in terms of both their morale and sentiment after over 15 months into this invasion?
Well, our morale is quite strong, but as you mentioned, it's still just 5 villages, and there are hundreds of more to go. And unfortunately, those have been achieved with losses on our side as well. Quite honestly, had we had even 3% of the capacity of United States Army of equipment, we would have probably liberated all of the captured area already.
And in terms of military aid, we know the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he paid a surprise visit to Ukraine this weekend. He announced $500 million in more military aid to Ukraine. So on that note, what sort of impact has Canadian support in particular had in this war and the Ukrainian counteroffensive?
Canadian support has been one of that, until at least in terms to relative terms, one of the biggest ones. So Canada, Lithuania, and others, some of the several other countries are the biggest supporters of Ukraine if you look at relative terms. But if you look to game changers, for example, United States, which has almost 9,000 A1 Abrams tanks, it is supplying generously 31 vehicles. We are grateful for 31 tanks, but quite honestly, Egypt has 1,400 A1 Abrams tanks. Had we had even a portion of that, Russians would have been gone from our territory by now.
So it's clear more support is needed. So what else is needed from Western allies in order for Ukraine to have a successful counteroffensive, sir?
Well, since the World War II, no country has made a major counteroffensive without air dominance, or at least at the level playing field. Currently, F-16s, which are by far not the most modern fighters, but which are probably enough at least to stop the Russian military superiority at the front lines, are badly needed. And so far, unfortunately, we have not been able to receive those.
All right, Mr. Zablonsky, a little over a minute left here, but in other recent news, we know the International Criminal Court, it's investigating the Kakhovka Dam explosion, which triggered flooding in southern Ukraine. So why is Russia bent on pinning the blame of this explosion on Ukraine? And where does Ukraine stand in terms of Russia's claims around this?
I don't believe that Russia deserves any attention to their claims because anything that was done by them, according to them, it was done by whoever, NATO, and whatever other forces. It shouldn't be even considered. There comes a time after somebody cries "oh, 500 times" falsely that you should not take care of that. But of course, they blew up the dam to stop the counteroffensive, and they did it as Ukrainian offensive was ready in the southern regions.
All right, sir, before we say goodbye, what else can you share with us in regards to the next moves in this counteroffensive and what the West should be keeping their eyes out for? Could we expect maybe a deeper thrust into occupied areas after the capture of these frontline villages?
I think the morale of Russian army is low and the morale of Ukrainian army is very high, and that's the main weapon that we currently have. And I would just like to thank, as I did by hearing Justin Trudeau speaking to Ukrainian Parliament, to extend our deepest thanks to Canada for all the aid that was provided to Ukraine. It's very significant, and it helped to save a lot of Ukrainian lives.
All right, Mr. Zablonsky, thank you again for giving us your time today on Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
All right, up next, our interview with Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group, about the importance of blood donation. On World Blood Donor Day, Canada continues to face a shortage of supply amid high demand for the life-saving fluid. According to Canadian Blood Services, there are about 150,000 open appointments for blood and plasma donation as Canada's inventory faces challenges. The organization says blood donor behavior has changed over the course of the pandemic, which is affecting donor attendance and appointment bookings. It also says that 1 in 2 people in Canada have required blood or blood products or have had a loved one who has. And although 1 in 2 people are eligible to donate blood and plasma, only 1 in 81 does. Meanwhile, certain myths around blood donation can be contributing to a fear of or lack of interest in providing this life-saving donation. Well, joining us now to help dispel some of these myths and address concerns around blood donation in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Great to be here.
So to get a better understanding of the demand here, how often is donated blood used in a medical setting? And do we have any numbers behind this demand?
Right. I mean, donated blood is very frequently used in medical settings, and certainly we look at it in terms of emergency and both planned procedures as well. Blood transfusions are extremely common, and especially when we look at severe injuries, managing blood disorders, and even providing support during chemotherapy and radiation treatments to cancer patients, we certainly need blood. Certainly, we also look at addressing complications during childbirth and that demand. So if you look at statistics, especially in the United States, they do say that every 2 seconds, someone in the United States needs blood or platelets. So we see something very similar in Canada as well.
A very high demand, Dr. Raut. So do we have enough donated blood to meet this demand in Canada?
I think that's the issue here. What we are seeing is there's been a lot of changes in the way we've managed things, especially during the pandemic, and people have become a little bit scared to give blood. So certainly that has caused a lot of challenges for us. But in the meantime, what we would want to do is certainly urge people to donate blood, especially for today, which is the World Blood Day.
Definitely, Dr. Raut. Now, addressing some of these concerns here, a lot of people might think, what sort of difference could a single blood donation make? So for some perspective, how many lives can a single person's blood donation help, Dr. Raut?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, if you look at just a single donation, you can separate that into red blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Each of these components can be treated, given to different patients and in different medical conditions as well. So potentially, even with one single donation, we're talking about saving potentially 3 lives by providing the components that they need.
That's quite the impact, Dr. Raut. Now, another common concern around blood donation is the amount of time that it could take to donate. So can you walk us through the process and where and how people can go about donating blood?
Right. So time is certainly a concern that people have, but it really shouldn't be. A person can arrive to the donation center. They get a quick health questionnaire to make sure they're eligible, a very quick physical examination with vitals, blood pressure, and then a quick check. And then, you'd go ahead and provide the donation. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes. After resting for a little bit, you have a light snack and then go home. Typically, the total procedure takes an hour.
Sounds pretty straightforward. Now, another concern that I've come across is the donation potentially depleting a donor's own blood supply and potentially weakening them or their immune system. So is there any logic to this concern here, Dr. Rout?
Right. We hear that concern quite a bit, but the human body has a remarkable ability to replenish blood very quickly. So really the important thing here is it does not deplete your own blood supply significantly, and it certainly does not weaken your immune system. Any of these short-term inconveniences are exactly that, short-term inconveniences, and very quickly you're back to normal.
All right, Dr. Rout, and there are concerns around donating blood while on certain medications. So what are some of the limitations to consider when it comes to this?
Right. So I think when we look at it, there are certain medications that are contraindications, but typically in those health questionnaires, we're able to see which medications would be a concern. More often, it's medications that treat infections or autoimmune disorders, but more often than not, if you're on a medication, it's more than likely you are fine to donate blood, and we just look at that on an individual basis.
All right, Dr. Rout. And what about conditions like high blood pressure and diabetes, which impact many Canadians and may affect interest in donating blood? So are there any concern, or are these concerns justified?
Right. As long as these conditions are well managed and under control, there's really no risk with that. We have a lot of people with high blood pressure and diabetes who do donate blood on a regular basis, and sometimes it's actually helpful. I had a patient recently that we actually recommended donating blood to bring down their ferritin levels, which for men can also cause issues with diabetes. Sometimes it's actually beneficial for these patients.
Always a helpful interview, Dr. Rout. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily Week in Review, and I hope you have a great weekend, Canada. Take care.